Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the poetry of Duke Redbird, which I'm reading out of Native Poetry in Canada. So Redbird was an Ojibwe poet. He was born in Ontario, and his poetry deals a lot with ritual, with memory, with the ways in which Indigenous culture can be preserved through a combination of memory and the performance of that memory through ritual and through ethical action. So you'll see that over the course of the poems that I'm going to read of his. But that's really sort of centrally important as far as Redbird's poetry goes. And it's connected, as is so often the case, to this sort of project of Indigenous resurgence, right? The recreation of political and cultural and social power for First Nations, Native American, Inuit, and Métis nations across Turtle Island in the face of settler colonialism. And so we see that ethic of resistance very much in the first poem included in this collection, which is called The Beaver. See how the beaver works all night without light in the darkness. He builds his dam, limb and branch, mud and sand, higher, stronger, greater dam. From dusk till dawn, his toil goes on and on. Then tomorrow you will see a bubbling stream become a pond, and later on a stagnant lake. And all the creepy, crawly creatures will crawl down to make a home within that putrid pond. With turtle, snake, frog, and crab, these neighbors now the beaver will have. But the deer, bear, lynx, and fox, raccoon, wolf, moose, and hawk will move far away to find a place the beaver hasn't been, where clear, cold, clean water still flows, living, laughing, tumbling liquid life. Waterfalls, brooks, and streams, these are highways for life's dreams. My son, do not become a beaver and build yourself a dam, for this is what the white man does with brick and stone and sand, till his mind is like that lake filled with weird, wicked wretches that give no peace. Then he cries to his Creator in desperation, "Please, God, my God, deliver me from damnation." So this is an interesting one. In the first place, it's worth noting that this takes the form of a fable, right? This is a very traditional Native American and First Nations storytelling method. A lot of traditional stories are set up as fables, as these sort of stories with personified or anthropomorphized animal characters and even plant characters, sometimes geographic locations, etc., etc. And they engage in particular actions that ultimately teach a moral lesson through the structure of this story. And so Redbird is very much picking up on that traditional Indigenous mode of storytelling by using these creatures that are symbolic of a larger principle and having them, particularly the beaver, engage in certain actions that are meant to teach a moral lesson. The beaver, of course, is a traditional symbol of Canada, and so it is associated with settler colonial Canadian identity. It's also very interesting because my sense is, from what I've heard and from what I've read and listened to, typically beavers are not sort of villainous or short-sighted or negative creatures in traditional Indigenous storytelling. So this is very much a sort of inversion of a typical ethos for a creature within an Indigenous story, I think. But again, because the beaver is aligned with settler colonial Canada, and ultimately the moral lesson is settler colonialism and capitalism construct a society in which individuals are constrained, they are limited, what they want to do, choose to do, etc., is restricted by the capitalist and settler colonialist structures of that society. And so in that sense, the symbolism of the beaver aligned with Canada outweighs the more traditional reverence for all living things that's typical of many North American indigenous cultures, including the Ojibwe. So that's kind of an interesting turn there. And then we have a number of poems that really sort of deal with ritual and its connection to memory, particularly the memory of First Nations culture, or Ojibwe culture specifically for Redbird, but indigenous culture more generally, because these poems are written in the 60s and 70s during the period of sort of pan-tribalism or pan-Indian movements in the US and Canada, where indigenous peoples really started to embrace the idea that Native Americans, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people are all somehow unified, right? So this is, on the one hand, a good thing because it creates a larger unified force that gives indigenous North Americans political power, voting power, economic power, etc., as opposed to different tribes, nations, and bands being sort of divided up and each acting independently. At the same time, it does erase or risk erasing a lot of the distinctive cultures of North American indigenous peoples. But in the period of, say, the American Indian movement and organizations like this, the Indian Power movement, things like this, there was a sense that unity was more valuable for gaining political, economic, social, and cultural rights than the preservation of individual nations, tribes, and bands as distinctive political entities. You combine that with the real socioeconomic forces that drove many indigenous people into cities where they lost their distinctive tribal identities in poly-indigenous neighborhoods. So this idea of preserving memory or reclaiming memory through things like ritual is really important in this period because it reflects this sort of return to indigenous ways of being in the world. So the next poem I'm going to read to you is called The Small Drum. The small drum throbbed a story, and the old man agreed, eyes dancing, head nodding in the firelight. His body moved to the rhythm of the drumstick, but he did not know it was his hand nor the drum between his legs. Mist precedes the day, and in the mist the old man saw his prayer and said nothing, but the small drum remembered. And so it's an interesting poem because the drum itself becomes the sort of physical repository of memory. The sort of protagonist, or one of the protagonists, being an old man, suggests someone nearing the end of their life, but also someone who has acquired a tremendous amount of wisdom and experience. And it seems that he loses that, right? He comes to sort of misrecognize the situation that he's in. He did not know it was his hand nor the drum between his legs, right? And yet the drum itself remembers. The physical artifact, which is arguably the other protagonist of this poem, remembers the culture, remembers this indigenous way of being in the world. We get another one that has a ritual component to it, and this one deals more with ritual and the experience of loss. Well, not more with, but it deals maybe more overtly with. This is called Tobacco Burns. Tobacco curls when touched by fire. The smoke rises up, blue and gray, a fog that holds medicine. The spirit is strong. The story is old. The smoke curls. I feel a sound. The sound of drums on distant hills, of buffalo hooves on frozen ground, a medicine chant wailing by breezes that have not blown for many moons nor suns, that shine no longer on brown children. My eyes seek a vision, for old people told of visions that were not seen by eyes, but burned in the mind and mouth of our men who fought battles but did not win. My body cries for strong medicine, but my eyes water from whiskey. My brain bleeds, my heart sweats. I regret that tobacco burns, and I am not strong. So again, there's a very ritualized element here. Tobacco played a major role in many indigenous ceremonies, and as well as drumming, which of course we saw in the previous poem, but we get sort of reintroduced here. The idea of a vision, seeking a vision, or experiencing a vision as a way of engaging with culture, with one's ancestry, with all these things. And yet it is a poem of profound loss, right? This last line, and I am not strong, reflects this sort of this desire to return to Ojibwe culture, or if we take this as the poet persona as opposed to Redbird specifically, as we should when reading a poem, a return to indigenous culture of some kind, right? For Redbird, again, specifically Ojibwe culture, but in a sort of pan-Indian context to indigenous culture of some kind, right? This desire to go back with the recognition that going back is not necessarily feasible, right? There has been so much loss, there has been so much that has been taken under settler colonialism and capitalism, the cultural genocide directed at indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, etc., that such a thing becomes very difficult to actually achieve. But it still exists in memory. It still exists in that sort of visceral and even kinetic desire to return to indigenous ways of being in the world. And we see that in the last of Redbird's poems that I'm going to read for you, which is called My Moccasins. My moccasins have not walked among the giant forest trees. My leggings have not brushed against the fern and berry bush. My medicine pouch has not been filled with roots and herbs and sweet grass. My hands have not fondled the spotted fawn. My eyes have not beheld the golden rainbow of the north. My hair has not been adorned with the eagle feather. Yet my dreams are dreams of these. My heart is one with them. The scent of them caresses my soul. And so again, there is this profound longing for a return to indigenous culture, for a return to ways of living in harmony with nature, in sustainable societies, etc., in implicit contrast to settler colonialism and capitalism, which, as we know from the current global climate change crisis, is clearly not sustainable. And as we've known for a long time, is not environmentally conscious, does not live in the world, but exploits the world and takes the world to be resources which can be plundered, etc., etc. Yeah, so again, there's this sort of clear desire in these poems to return to these indigenous ways of being, while there's a deep awareness and almost a nostalgic sense of separation from that way of being in the world.